I am so thrilled to introduce Porter. Porter is the first investment I ever made as an institutional investor. I met him at YC in 2015 when he and his co-founder Ryan were on stage presenting, and they got off stage and I met them and I was like, this is a company that is building something that absolutely should exist and doesn't. And I kind of committed right there, which I haven't done since, but it was my first one. But I'm thrilled that I did that because as I've gotten to know them over the past 4 years, everything that I've gotten to know about both Porter and Ryan has reinforced that I'm so glad we invested in this company and I'm so glad they're building this. So Porter started his career in Goldman and then he ended up starting Jopwell. And Jopwell's mission is to help Black, Latinx, and Native American founders and students be better represented in the workforce that we have, because our workforce does not look like our world. And Porter, this is not just Porter's job. I think of it as Porter's life mission, right? He's written a book about it. He's done things to enhance Jopwell in terms of building stock photos that show our community the way it should be. And I am inspired every day by the work that they do. And I'm really thrilled that Porter is going to talk to you about how to build a diverse and inclusive workforce, because when do you start building a diverse and inclusive workforce? When you have one person. So Porter will talk more to you about that.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks. Hey everybody. So my name is Porter Braswell. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Jopwell. And at a high level, we are a holistic diversity solution, assisting companies with the recruitment and retention of professionals and students of color. So I have 15 minutes, so I'm not going to solve the world's problem with this presentation, but I'll get into a little bit about the Jopwell founding story, what we do and why we do it. Then I'll get into some of the things I've learned from leaders within corporate America in terms of how they've been able to go about and build diverse and inclusive cultures. And then a couple of things that we can all start to do literally tomorrow to drive this conversation forward. So again, I have 15 minutes, so we will keep it somewhat high level here. But the Jopwell story. So basically, starting in high school, I was a product of diversity recruiting initiatives. I started working at Morgan Stanley for 2 summers, my junior and senior years, all through diversity initiatives, and then went on to Yale. I played basketball there, recognizing I wasn't going to the NBA. I continued to stay in a very entry-level finance-focused opportunity and spent 3 summers interning at Goldman Sachs. And I started my career there. And I was there for 3 years buying and selling currencies. And while my day-to-day job was to buy and sell currencies, I would still assist with diversity recruiting efforts, being one of the few people of color that worked on the trading floor alongside my co-founder. And we were happy to do it, but it was pretty awkward and really inefficient. But what we saw was that diversity recruiting wasn't just a financial institutional challenge, it was all companies. And at the time, this is the spring of 2014, a lot of tech companies were coming out with their lack of diversity stats for the first time. And everybody kept pointing to the reason why there's a lack of diversity is because there's a lack of a pipeline, the talent doesn't exist. And of course, that's just not true. And so my co-founder and I decided that we would initially build Jopwell to be a platform to directly connect potential candidates with opportunities, but we fully recognize that the challenges were much more broad than that. And so at scale, we wanted to become a holistic diversity solution. So we started the business in the winter of 2015. So we're about 4.5 years in, coming up on 5 years. We've raised about 15 million in institutional money. There's 60 of us now at the company and based in New York City. We work with about 250 or so amazing companies, ranging from really large banks to a lot of the major tech companies and a lot of really awesome brands in between. And so I've been very fortunate to work with a lot of leaders. And so here are a couple of things that I've learned. So for organizations that do diversity the best, I think the first thing that the leaders, and I'll speak from like the point of view, given that we're all founders here, that the leaders do really well is that they can clearly define what diversity means for their company. And so I think a lot of times it's really easy to say diversity because you can avoid getting very specific about what are you actually talking about. And so in the context of Jopwell, we say Black, Latinx, and Native Americans, because for us, that's the challenge and the pain point that we're trying to solve. And there's 44 million Black, Latinx, and Native Americans in college or in the workforce. So it's a major market to itself. And the challenge is that professionals of color face are very different than gender or sexual orientation or socioeconomic backgrounds. And so for leaders, like any other good challenge that you're trying to solve, for, and as you're building products for, you have to be very clear about what do you mean by diversity. Because again, it's easy just to say diversity when you're talking to your companies, but if you're willing to get very specific about your actual pain points, then you can start to apply actual solutions. So that's number one. Number two, we need to understand and articulate why diversity matters. So intrinsically, I think we all can agree that we know that diversity is important, but a lot of times when I'm interacting with leaders, they kind of get tripped up on being able to articulate to their company why diversity matters. And so 3 things that I find to be very kind of out of the pocket you can always refer to is that 1, diversity is just good for business. McKinsey has done a ton of reports that prove that more ethnically diverse companies are more likely to outperform financially their less ethnically diverse peers. So pointing to that it's good for business is like the first thing. Number 2 is that diversity drives innovation and it leads to disruption. So if you take different backgrounds, contexts, experiences of individuals sitting at a table and they can bring their authentic selves to work, that's where you can really start to look at challenges differently. And then number 3, they're changing demographics within the US. So by 2040, the majority of people in this country are going to be people of color. So you need to have a workforce that reflects that change if you want to understand these changing consumer dynamics. So being able to kind of always point to the reasons why diversity matters, and as a leader, it's your responsibility to be able to articulate that to your company. It's a really important thing that we've noticed for those companies that do it really well. Number 3, we need to be intentional about building diverse teams. So diversity doesn't just happen. And oftentimes, of course, we rely on internal referrals. And so if your organization looks similar and comes from a similar background, then odds are that they're going to be referring individuals that are very similar as well. And so actually that happened to Jopwell. So my co-founder and I started the business, both African-American males that went to Ivy League schools. We hired 2 people I went to high school with, and then they hired 2 of their friends. So when we first looked up, Jopwell was 6 folks, 5 of which were African-American, and 5 of us went to an Ivy League school. And so that's very not diverse. And we fell into it because we hired our friends. Now, we weren't being intentional about keeping people out, but the reality of it is that we just relied on our friends. And that's kind of the initial team, what it looked like. And so once we got there, we recognized, okay, we have to do things differently if we're going to be diverse within Jopwell. So flash forward to where we are today at 60 people, majority female, largest ethnicity is African American, followed by Latinx, every socioeconomic background you can imagine, educational levels very different throughout the entire organization. So we've become the most diverse organization I've ever seen, but it was very intentional as we recognized from the early days that we have to be intentional about it because diversity doesn't just happen even if you're building a diversity tech platform. So number 4, the change starts with us as leaders. When we go and we connect with a lot of different organizations, what we have noticed is that the leaders that are driving the conversations around the importance of diversity and inclusion build a culture that's definitely rooted in that. And oftentimes you'll have diversity, and as you scale, you'll have teams that are focused on diversity, but if they're not reporting directly to the CEO, they tend to be less effective. And so as you all scale your teams, it's not somebody else's job to talk about the importance of diversity. It's your job as the founder, and you really set the tone. And diversity and inclusion in these conversations, it's not like a seasonal challenge. It's something that's something that will remain with you throughout the history of your company. And so becoming that expert at this stage is incredibly important. And again, the best companies that are really driving diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's the leaders that are talking about it. It's a board level conversation, and then everybody throughout the organization buys in. And then number 5, the difference between inclusion versus belonging. So I'm sure we have all heard many different analogies about inclusion versus belonging and the importance of belonging. The way I like to think about it, and I'm sure you've heard this before, whereas inclusion is being invited to go to a dance, belonging is actually being asked to dance. I like to think of it as very beyond that. Belonging is you are asking somebody to dance. And so in that context of making sure that your cultures are built around people truly feeling like they belong there, then that's where you allow the value of diversity to be brought out. The value of diversity is people bringing, again, their authentic selves to work in their experiences and their context. But if there's not a culture or an environment where people feel like they belong, truly belong, then you're not going to leverage their diversity. And the power of diversity is the differences. And so you have to create cultures where people can belong. And then really quickly, a couple of things that we can start to do tomorrow as leaders to start taking these steps. One is being a diversity champion. And so basically being a diversity champion is treating others how you would like to be treated. It's very simple, but when we're talking about diversity, at times it can become very complicated. So being a diversity champion is not calling somebody out for their otherness. So I've been in rooms where people that are, trying to include me in the conversation will say, Porter, what do you think like the Black community will think about this? And I've been the only person in the room from that community, and my response is like, I can't talk to you about the Black community. I can talk to you about my experiences and how I perceive it. So despite somebody's best effort to bring me into the conversation, you're still calling out my otherness, and you're putting a spotlight on me to answer a question that I can't really answer. And so being a diversity champion, again, is being aware enough to know like the time and place to coax out differences and conversations. What it is when you are a leader and you have people that are from a certain community, and if you know that community is being disproportionately affected by something that's like in the news, well, you should probably bring that person aside to let them know in the appropriate setting that you are aware of what's going on and you're there just to be a sounding board if they ever need somebody to talk to. And so again, if you want people to bring their whole selves and their authentic selves to work as a diversity champion, you have to have, I don't want to call it the common sense, but you have to be aware enough to know the time and place to have these conversations so that people can trust you and eventually trust the organization that they can bring their full selves to work. Number two is creating settings where people can thrive. So I think it's incredibly important for the organizations that we work with, those companies that are very transparent and they have not rules, but guidelines about how certain things work. They tend to, again, build more inclusive and equitable cultures. And so with meetings, there's a general way in which they run their meetings that's very transparent for the whole organization, and that like the loudest person in the room doesn't win the conversation. There's structures that they put in place where they mandate that everybody speaks up at a certain point in time. People understand when raises will happen throughout the company, when it asks for promotions. That's all very transparent because they have systems in place where everybody knows the appropriate time. Thank you. Everybody knows the appropriate time to have those types of conversations. And so as you're building your teams on day one, start thinking through the different environments and how you are setting up your cultures such that it's one where, regardless of your background or where people have worked in the past, everything's transparent. Everybody knows what the rules of the road are. Number three is being a mentor. And so I'm sure we all know the value of the importance of being a mentor and having mentors. But specifically, when you are mentoring those from underserved or disproportionate underrepresented communities within your company, it's really important that you are being an active listener and you're not just spewing your general mentorship type stuff that we often find our way into doing. When you're mentoring somebody from an underrepresented community, they are experiencing that workplace and the world differently than you may experience it. So it's really important to have empathy when you're mentoring and you're trying to promote those from underrepresented backgrounds to take into account their unique experiences. And I think oftentimes my best mentors are those that recognize, going out and raising capital as a man of color and leading a company as a man of color. It's just very different than if I wasn't. And so my best mentors understand that and they coach me through my experiences. And I always find those mentors to truly get it. And that's where, again, I feel the most comfortable to bring out my experiences and to ultimately drive change. So as leaders, it's our jobs and responsibilities to ensure that we are being proactive when we're listening to the individuals that we are mentoring if they come from a different background. And then lastly, be curious. These conversations at times can be uncomfortable when you're engaging with employees or people that work within your workplaces. But if you lead through empathy and you are willing to learn from others, again, you can bring out the power of diverse individuals. And we are all incredibly fortunate that we are a part of these amazing networks. And just looking around the room, this is a way more diverse room than the rooms I'm normally in when it comes to like the VC world. And so we can rely on each other and ask each other questions about best practices and things that we're seeing work well, but it requires action. And if you're willing to be curious and you're willing to have these conversations, then I think collectively we can all do a better job at it. So anything I can do to help, I'm more than happy to help. Porter@jopwell.com, and thank you.
Thanks. That was awesome. And I actually really appreciate it because I think being intentional about diversity is something that we're small companies, so I keep hammering it even amongst 5 people, but it sometimes feels like it's harder to, it feels harder at such an early stage. You're like, well, I got to also hire quickly. Yeah. And I think one of the tensions that I feel there, even in a very diverse team, is that I don't know how to look outside of the immediate community quickly and efficiently. And I'm curious, like tactically, how would you try and solve that? How did you solve that at Jopwell?
Sorry, your question was how do you look outside of like the natural community?
Yeah, the natural community you have around you, exactly.
So that's, not to plug Jopwell, that's why we built Jopwell. But truly, because for all size companies, but the reality of it is that you have to do things differently. So you have to like literally physically put yourself in different communities and different settings to find people from different backgrounds. And once you start doing that, all it takes, especially when you're 5 employees or 10 employees, all it takes is 1 or 2, because now you have their network. And so for us, we don't have an issue being diverse moving forward because we are so diverse. So our natural applicant funnel looks like America, basically. It actually looks more like New York City, which is great. So we are very reflective of what New York City looks like. But once you break through that, it's really important that you do that before you're like 10 employees, because then it'll like truly organically happen. But you have to be incredibly intentional at that stage. So literally fly all over the country, do what you have to do, go to college campuses, go down to HBCUs, do whatever it is you have to do. But once you get the first couple in, then it becomes easier.
Thanks, Porter. That was great. So as you mentioned, today we know through research that diversity really is a value driver for organizations, but I'm wondering is there a way to quantify the value of a diverse team or to measure that quantitatively, especially like, when you're talking to enterprise companies in terms of, Jopwell, that may be a question you get, but I'm just curious your thoughts on that or whether even that matters.
Yeah, so we are very fortunate that we built this business in a time where McKinsey, Bain, BCG, they've all come out with reports that quantitatively prove that diversity leads to bottom line success and that it's good for business and it's more than just a feel good thing. So we've been able to build a business on the back of that type of research. Now for Jopwell, what I believe is that and the reason why we work with 250, 300 companies instead of 100,000 companies is because we want to work with companies that truly get it and that they then know how to define success with leveraging Jopwell. And I think it's really hard, especially as you're growing and scaling a company, to make 2 pitches in the context of a conversation. So for us, it would be really hard to pitch why diversity matters, get them on board with that, and then pitch, and you should be using Jopwell to solve it. So we typically only work with companies where they already get it, and now it's a singular pitch, leverage Jopwell. And so when we have inbound requests for companies that want to work with us, we interview them as much as they interview us. And I like that different type of dynamic and tension to give us more leverage in those conversations. And so, but again, we have been a recipient of being able to build off of all the quantitative research that's already out there.
Because of the changing demographics in America, it's unlikely that this will ever change. But the question, you lead with diversity is important, one, because it drives business value. There might be scenarios in which that context changes, and premising all of this in business value, do you ever just feel like that's actually shaky ground to be standing on? Where, again, demographics are changing, so in that sense, the macro is probably just up and to the right. But what if you operate in a context where, having a less diverse team actually does create better business outcomes? Isn't diversity still important? So how do you think about just that foundation of that argument?
So I think the conversation for years on years have been that diversity is a feel-good thing, and we should pay for this from like the foundation part of like a company, and that's bullshit. And so like it's rooted in diversity is good for business. And so it's not just my voice that's saying that now. It's been proven time and time again. So
how would your argument change if all of a sudden tomorrow diverse teams were less profitable? Isn't it still important that we have diverse teams?
Yes, it's very important that we still have diverse teams, but I don't see that changing. So when it does change, I'll think through that.
But so let me just follow up. Companies are getting more political. Companies are getting more activist. A dynamic of diversity we are less accustomed to talking about right now is political diversity, which I actually think is starting to matter more. That we can't find ourselves in these scenarios where our company is full of easy markers Republicans, easy marker full of Democrats, because diversity matters. But that's a scenario where, as the political landscape and the business landscape are starting to become more activist, like you might actually find yourself in scenarios where your business outcomes aren't correlated in the same way. You know, if you think about a Nike right now, you think about a Chick-fil-A right now, you think about diversity on that dimension, you know, don't we have to sort of underpin this more broadly than just it's good for business?
Well, I feel like you're talking about politics at work, and that's a very different conversation. And so I haven't thought through that, to be honest. I don't really think through politics at work. My singular life's mission, as Shri discussed, is around Black, Latinx, Native Americans and being able to bring their authentic selves to work and finding success. And so does politics come up in the context of that conversation? Yes. But I think the best way to have those dialogues is to seek for being curious and seeking more information and trying to understand a perspective of a different person. But again, that's also back to being like a diversity champion and just naturally being curious and treating folks how you would like to be treated. So to me, it's one singular conversation, but politics at work, yeah, we can have a further conversation about that.
Cool. I just wanted to go back to your previous comment about choosing to solve or sort of fight a battle on one front instead of two fronts, right? Like you're choosing to work today with companies who know this is a problem, get it, and want a solution. You are helping them think through that. And totally get it. I think we're in the same space today, right? It's like find the early adopters, make them the champions. But how do you know when, or have you decided when it's going to be time for you to be the market maker, or like not just fight the battle on the front of like, if you want to do this better, we're for you, but like you don't want to do this better yet, or you're not sure we're going to get you to do it better. Like, how do you think about the sequencing?
I think that's like through the scale of the business. So there's 60 of us right now. So we choose where we want to place our chips and fight our battles. And so for us, it's really hard. And going through YC and having, you know, being fortunate to have the incredible investors that we have and the learnings that we've had of doing things that don't scale and building something that people love. Well, we're still doing that. And so before we start to try to tackle challenges on like a global scale or challenges for, you know, companies that don't get diversity and we're going to fight them to make sure that they properly get it, we're not placing our bet on those. We're not placing our chips on those bets right now. So that will definitely be something that will come up, but we've taken the path of we're going to work with those companies that get it so we can be the most effective we can be. And most importantly, provide opportunities for our community where they can thrive and be successful.